Welcome back to From Washington Al Mundo. I'm Mauricio Gavarcarone, and my guest today is Congressman Albio Sires. But now we're going to talk about Iran, and Congressman Sires is going to remain with us. Iran is one of the most probing issues currently from a human rights perspective, has been for decades, and from a securities perspective, has been for decades also, but obviously now people are paying more attention to it. And to speak about Iran, to give us more of a perspective, we're pleased to have Dr. Majid Sadeghopur, who's a Iranian human rights activist with the National Coalition of Pro-Democracy Advocates. Majid, how are you, sir?
Very good. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. And as I mentioned, I have Congressman Albio Sires of New Jersey, a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, here in the studio with me. And we're very interested to hear about the current situation in Iran. One of the things that obviously really got my attention was the recent report by Amnesty International, which showed that public executions have quadrupled recently in Iran. Tell us a little bit more what's happening on the ground.
Absolutely. Certainly, I wanted to also say hello to Congressman Sires. Certainly, we have worked with his office in the House, and he's been very supportive of the cause of the Iranian Americans as a whole, and certainly the rights of the Iranian population. So I wanted to, on behalf of the community, thank him. Having said that, I think oftentimes executions are an indicator or kind of bellwether of what the conditions are and the legitimacy of the regime. In Iran, over the past 33 years, and the government of Iran has executed, at least publicly on average, over 300 people every year. As you mentioned, most of those folks have been in public, have been executed in public to intimidate, to scare people into submission. And unfortunately, that is the reality. And the last report that you mentioned, Amnesty International alluded to, absolutely recalls again the escalating number of executions in Iran. These are the folks who want regime change in Iran and want to bring about a secular democracy in Iran. And we, as a community, Iranian Americans want exactly what the people of Iran were screaming in the streets in 2009, which is to bring about a democratic, secular republic in Iran and get rid of the current regime in its totality.
Majid, I think Congressman Sires wanted to ask you a question.
Hi, Dr. Majid. How are you?
I'm very good.
I was just wondering if you can comment on the recent elections in Iran.
The parliamentary elections?
The parliamentary elections. Obviously,
right.
There's a lot of fraud in the election, but I just wonder if you can comment. I know the people that wanted to run couldn't run, and they have to get permission to run. So
Right. I think if you look at it, certainly the whole system is vetted from the top down. So it's essentially a shell, a veneer to fool the international community and even the domestic audience in giving the impression that there is actually a form of democracy within the government of Iran. But in reality, for the past 33 years, the government of Iran has acted exactly as it has, which has been a homogeneous, single-minded regime run by a supreme leader. In the past, it was Khomeini, and currently Khamenei is the supreme leader. And keeping in mind that these supposed folks who were standing for elections were pre-vetted and selected to represent a certain strength or weakness towards the different factions within the Iranian regime, the outcome is almost irrelevant because it does not represent the will of the Iranian people. It does represent, however, the will of the supreme leader.
Majid, explain a little bit. A lot of the media stories have talked about almost this rift between the Ahmadinejad crowd and the Ayatollah. And I saw one which is obviously bad news when a news article starts quoting, quote-unquote, moderates within hardliners. So when everybody's a hardliner, but then you have different hardliners, and I mean, that's just bad news. Explain a little bit about that and put that in perspective for us.
Sure. Let me, if I may, I'll try to give it some context because I think it is what you asked me to do, and I hope I can shed some light on this. I don't know if Congressman Sires recalls, but he joined 113 other members of Congress in 2010, co-sponsoring a resolution calling for support for the Iranian opposition and the some folks are in Camp Ashraf in Iraq. But to answer your questions directly, and I'll get back to the Camp Ashraf issue later, the rift between the different factions within the Iranian regime is real. It has been since the very early days of this regime. What has enabled these guys to consolidate up to now and remain in power has been essentially the first degree of oppression, the oppression machine run by the Revolutionary Guards. Second, its use of women, similar to Nazis having anti-Semitism as their engine. Iranian regime has misogyny and the use of women, which is more than 50 to 60% of the population, as the engine that drives the Revolutionary Guard and the Basiji and all the repression machines. And so with that empowerment, then the regime can stay in power with the Revolutionary Guards holding it in place. And that is reality. That is why Ahmadinejad has come to power. In reality, there is no moderates in the Iranian government. And the United States policy needs to recognize that the Iranian regime, if it wanted to deal on the nuclear issue, anything, first and foremost, it would settle its business within the population of Iran, and it would not massacre the Iranian people as it has been for the past 33 years. And a regime that does not have legitimacy, moderate or conservative, is irrelevant. Unfortunately, it is the fact.
No, you're absolutely right. And you mentioned U.S. policy, and I found something that you wrote in 2007, which was really fascinating. You wrote in 2007, 21 years later, the policymakers are beginning to be awakened to the true makeup of the regime. The strategic opening sought by the U.S. in the 1980s, by the Europeans in the late 90s, which continues to this day, and the persistent hopes of moderation have led to one distinct and palpable reality: a more emboldened extremist government in Iran. You were absolutely right.
That is the reality. That is why the Iranian people and its organized opposition were the ones who divulged Iran's nuclear weapons program. I'm referring to an organization called Mujahideen Khalq. They are the ones who divulged Iran's nuclear weapons program, because more than anybody else, it is the Iranian people who don't want these ayatollahs to gain nuclear weaponry. Because if they do, then they will be God knows how long in power. And the reality is, when the oppressor is played with, in other words, in the sense that we appease the oppressor, inevitably the oppressed get oppressed even further. And quite conversely, when we give legitimacy to the cause of the oppressed, then the oppressor obviously becomes weakened. And hence the effectiveness of the sanctions that people are referring to. It is what we have called for 30 years. It is what would hopefully, I know Congressman certainly is on a Foreign Affairs Committee that is headed by Congresswoman Ileana Ross-Littman, certainly Congressman Diaz-Balad and others have been very active in supporting our call for increased pressure on the Iranian government, support for the Iranian opposition, including the MEK, and certainly they have done that, and we certainly are looking forward to working with them. And we thank everybody, all the members of Congress who have been stepping up and supporting our cause.
Majid, let me ask you, what more, and the President yesterday spoke about it, what more should the administration, the executive branch, be doing?
Well, I think strengthening the sanctions is what needs to happen. It will weaken the Iranian regime. Let me give you an example.
What still? I mean, we have sanctions to a degree. What more needs to be done in sanctions? What are they afraid to do?
Well, to complete oil embargo on Iran. Mm-hmm. Do not buy oil from Iran. Yeah. Period. It is their lifeline.
Okay.
And at the end of the day, the reason why they don't is because people are afraid of oil prices.
Well, there is complicated scenarios involved here. I am not the expert on these issues to the extent that I would know what sanctions inherently. I know inherently what they do, but in generally speaking, sanctions against Iran have been more verbiage than in reality. We have to make these sanctions bite. That's one aspect of it all. Weakening the oppressor. The second portion of it all has to do with empowering the oppressed. And that's where the United States government needs to shift its policy by legitimizing the activity of the Iranian opposition and its most organized opposition group, which is the MEK, the Mujahideen Khalq. Relative to what you had mentioned earlier, that the Iranian, we were looking for moderates in the Iranian government, and even some people are still looking for moderates in the Iranian government. As part of that policy, the United States put the MEK on the list of foreign terrorist organizations to try to appease the Iranian government. What has resulted from it is that we ended up with Ahmadinejad and Iran's more advanced nuclear weapons program. Our argument is that this is wrong. What we need to do is empower the Iranian people, remove this unjust designation that the EU and the UK have removed already. It is what right now 100 members of Congress through House Resolution 60 have called for. It is what former Director of FBI Louis Freeh, Michael Mukasey, Howard Dean, John Bolton, James L. Jones, all of these folks have called for this designation to be lifted, because it will give us the political space. It will send a signal to Iran that the Iranian people can and have the right to oppose this Iranian regime. And given that the Iranian population has at least a 100-year history with uprisings, overthrowing despotic governments. In 1906, we had the Constitutional Revolution. 1953, we had the revolution that brought Mossadegh and the democratically elected parliament. And then 1979, overthrowing of the Shah. All of these were done by the Iranian people in their own will, without foreign intervention, without the United States forces having to spend a single dime. And that is what can happen in Iran with this regime. And that is what we would ask for.
Well, and I think at the end of the day, the Iranian regime knows that and knows the ability of the people to rise and of the people to oppose the regime. And that's why they're heightening, going back to the amnesty report and what we talked about first and foremost, that's why they're heightening the repression, because they're so afraid of that.
Absolutely. I think to your point, I think certainly Mr. Sires and others know and have been working on, there is a House has taken up a measure and asked, and I think it's moved in certain aspects.
Majid, I'm sorry, but we've run out of time. Dr. Majid Sadeghopur, thank you so much for being with us, and you always have a stage here to be able to tell us the reality of what's happening in Iran. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you for having me.
We'll be right back.